Well, it's great to be here. This has been a very unique conference. I go to lots of conferences, and they all have a particular orientation. Recently, I spoke to musicians, graphic artists, librarians, 12-year-olds, science winners from around the United States. And every group is different, but every group is actually interested in what this conference is all about. And the conference itself has been very creative and innovative. So it's a great introduction to me to Australia. This is a nice piano. Where's the on-off switch? My daughter actually, when she was 9, sat down at my father's 1908 Baldwin Grand and looked very perplexed. And I asked her, well, what's the matter? And she said, well, I don't know how to turn this on. So, and you see kids now just going up to, pictures on the wall and trying to swipe them. That will actually work pretty soon. But let's talk about creativity and innovation. One aspect of it is it's unpredictable. In fact, specific projects are unpredictable. And as you look at each innovative step forward, there's always some drama behind it. I've had the pleasure of spending some time with Tanya, and there's certainly a lot of drama behind putting together an event like this. When iPhone comes out with some new advance, there's lots of drama and a human story behind that. Yet, there's an aspect of creativity and innovation that's highly predictable, and it's very surprising. And that's essentially what I'd like to share with you today. If we look at the history of computers, going back to the 1890 American census, we see a very smooth exponential rise in their capability per unit currency. So, in fact, just since I was a student, when I went to MIT, a computer took up half a building, cost tens of millions of dollars, was thousands of times less powerful than this computer. So this is billions of times more powerful per dollar, constant dollar, than the computer I used as a student. Trillions of times more powerful than the computers that were used in 1890. So this is actually $1 trillion of computation and communication circa 1970. It's $1 million of computation circa 1995. We're all carrying around vast amounts of power, and it's very ubiquitously distributed. A kid in Africa with a smartphone has access to more information and knowledge than the President of the United States or Australia did 15 years ago. I used that line recently and then noticed Chelsea Clinton sitting in the front row, and I said, that would be your father, actually. And he did a good job anyway, and I'm sure he has a smartphone today, as do billions of other people. People say, well, only the wealthy will have access to these technologies. And I say, yeah, like cell phones. And in fact, you had to be wealthy to have a mobile phone 15, 20 years ago. If someone took out a mobile phone in a movie, that was a signal that this person is a member of the power elite, and they didn't take it out of their pocket because it was very big and heavy and didn't do very much, and even making phone calls, it did with a great deal of difficulty. These will be in everybody's hands very soon. There's already 5 billion of them, and they're expanding exponentially. But that trajectory, and I'll show you these curves that go back to the 1890 census in the case of computation, looks like a very smooth curve, but it's made up of millions of innovative steps, competitions, initial public offerings, bankruptcies, lots of human drama, and yet it follows this very smooth, predictable trajectory. Now, how can that be? I mean, how can you get something predictable out of lots of projects, each of which is full of unpredictable human drama? In fact, you don't see any evidence on these graphs of the big things that happened to human civilization. People say, well, it must have slowed down during the Great Depression. No, it didn't. It just completely ignored the Depression. Well, it must have slowed down in the recent recession. That's not true either. Okay, it must have gone faster during World War I or World War II or the Cold War, because war is the father of invention. That didn't happen either. It's a very smooth progression. Now, if it were the case that computer science, and that's not the only example of this, it basically pertains to any information technology, were made up of a few people, there were 5 people working on advancing computers in the world, it would be erratic and unpredictable. But because there's millions of people, it forms a very predictable course. We're always using the last tools to create the next set of tools. So the tools expand in their power at an exponential pace. We see other examples in science of getting a predictable result out of very unpredictable, random, chaotic results. The classical example of that is thermodynamics, which comes from the 19th century, which predicts the future of a gas. So if you look at the mathematics of thermodynamics, which relatively few people do, but it actually models each particle as following a random walk. So by definition, you can't tell where this molecule will be in 10 seconds. It's random. But because of the laws of large numbers and the statistical effects of lots of chaotic events, the overall properties of the gas are highly predictable to a very high degree of precision, according to the laws, they're considered scientific laws of thermodynamics. It's a similar phenomena here. I call it the law of accelerating returns. And it does give us one way of predicting the future, not specifically which project will succeed, but what the overall properties of these different information technologies will be. You could predict that search engines were coming 15 years ago because the enabling, if you figured out how much memory do you need, how fast your computers have to be, you could also see that a search engine was very much needed because the information was growing exponentially in the internet, nobody could find anything. You could predict when that would become feasible. But the fact that it would be these couple of kids at Stanford in a late-night dorm room challenge who would take over search, that's unpredictable. So this is not a guaranteed way to make investments, but it is an important thing to do when you're planning a project, particularly a technology project. We have an e-reader project now in one of my companies, and it's affected by display resolutions and mobile computing and cellular devices and communication bandwidth speeds and so on. And we'll actually plot out what those attributes of these technologies will be in January 2012, January 2013, and so on. Even though I've been doing this for 30 years, I'm surprised at, wow, mobile computing will be that different in 2 years? People, we get a lot of business plans. We do some mentoring and early stage investing, and I'd say the majority of them, before we've had an opportunity to work with these teams, kind of assume, and this is the common assumption that people have, the future's going to be kind of like the present. Maybe cell phones will be a little smaller. If you actually work out these predictable attributes of information technology, you see how radical change will be now in very short periods of time. I mean, think back 3-4 years ago, most people didn't use social networks, wikis, blogs. 12 years ago, people didn't use search engines. That really sounds like ancient history. The world is changing faster and faster because of this exponential growth of information technology. I gave a speech not too long ago at the University of Basel on the occasion of their 550th anniversary. And this university opened up 20 years after Gutenberg made his invention of the printing press, not too far away from where he did that. And I said, wow, that's exciting. You must have had some of Gutenberg's books when you opened your doors in 1440 or something like that. And they said, yes, we got them very quickly, only a century later. I mean, that was fast in those days. In fact, it took 400 years for the printing press to reach a mass audience. The telephone did that in 50 years, reached a quarter of the American, European, and Australian populations in 50 years. Cell phone did that in 7 years. Social networks, wikis, and blogs did that in 3 years. The pace of change is getting faster and faster because as these exponentials reach a certain threshold, they really become transformative, and that's happening at a faster and faster pace. Now, I got into this because I decided I would be an inventor when I was 5. I'm not really sure how that came about, but my parents were very active in giving me enrichment toys and erector sets and things I could put together into little gadgets. And I go through the neighborhood and collect different parts and take things apart and try to make inventions. And I had this idea, if I could put them together in just the right way, I could create transcendent effects. I didn't have that vocabulary when I was 5. Came up with that a year ago, I think. But I can remember the feeling. It was kind of a magical feeling. You could do magical things if you found just the right idea for putting these things together. And I discovered the computer when I was 12. But the most important discovery was about 30 years ago, 1981, that I noticed that timing was critical to being successful. Most inventors actually do get to work the gadgets they propose. 95% of these teams that give us proposals, if they got the resources, would build exactly what they say. But 95% of those projects would fail because the timing is wrong. Being in the right place at the right time is critical. Sergey Brin of Google and Larry Page had a great idea about reverse engineering the links on the internet to create a search engine, but they did it at exactly the right time. And it turns out timing is pretty important in anything: investing, inventing, romance. You got to be in the right place at the right time. So, realizing this, I began to be an ardent student of technology trends, and I really didn't expect to find anything very predictable, because the common wisdom is you can't predict the future. But I thought maybe if I gathered a lot of data and visualized it in the right way and squinted at it a little bit, maybe I could see some trends and make educated guesses. And I made a very surprising discovery, which is if you measure the underlying properties of information technology, the classical one and the first one I did is the power of computers per unit currency. So instructions per second per constant dollar. It forms an exquisitely smooth exponential curve. If you put them on a logarithmic graph, and I'll show you that, where as you go up the graph, you're multiplying by powers of 10. It's just a very smooth progression through thick and thin, through war and peace, through boom times and recessions. Nothing has had any effect on it. And it goes from one paradigm to another. In our deep conversation panel with Dan Dennett the other night, he challenged that and says, well, exponentials don't go on forever, and that's correct. In the history of computation, each paradigm ran out of steam, but what happened is, as one paradigm ran out of steam, for example, shrinking vacuum tubes, which was the paradigm in the 1950s, and that finally hit a wall, that created research pressure to create the next paradigm. And I'll show you then how the next paradigm took over, and that transistors lasted for a while, and then finally chips and Moore's law came into being, and Moore's law is going to come to an end, but the sixth paradigm is already underway, which is computing in 3 dimensions. This ongoing law of accelerating returns, this exponential growth, goes from paradigm to paradigm. Will it go on forever? Well, not necessarily. You could ask, well, based on the laws of physics, there must be some ultimate limits to computation or communication or other information technologies. And yes, there are ultimate limits, but they're not very limiting. Based on what we know about the laws of physics, and these kinds of very fine molecular circuits have already been demonstrated, we can go through this century with continued exponential growth to a point where 2 pounds of computation would be trillions of times more powerful than the human brain. So as a limit, yes, there's a limit, but it's a very abstract limit and doesn't really, it's not very limiting. And it turns out it's not just computation. It affects anything that's comprised of information. And the industries that are affected by this and the areas of human endeavor are getting broader and broader. I mean, I mentioned the conferences I've been at recently. This music conference read like a computer conference in terms of the highly sophisticated technologies that people are using to create music. Same for graphic arts, same for library sciences, same for these junior high school kids who are deeply affected by this technology. In fact, they were quite open and accepting of this exponential growth, which is a little ironic because I speak sometimes to older audiences, and even though they've been around a long time, they don't necessarily perceive it as quickly as these kids did. They were coming up to me afterwards and said, oh yeah, things are so different. When I was 8, I couldn't do X, Y, Z. And even in the few years that they've been involved with technology, they can see the exponential growth, which is really occurring at a very rapid rate. Now, one area that is now being transformed from not being an information technology to being one, and therefore subject to this exponential growth, is health and medicine. Now, health and medicine was not an information technology up until just recently. I mean, yeah, we used computers to help organize the information, but basically it was hit or miss. We just find things that happen to work. To some extent, we systematized the search for drugs. Drug development was called drug discovery. We might systematically go through 10,000 compounds to find something that lowered blood pressure or killed HIV or whatever outcome we were trying to design. But in fact, we couldn't design them. We could just hope to find them. And biology, health and medicine was this collection of accidentally found discoveries. Therefore, it was not subject to exponential growth. It was subject to linear growth. That was still pretty useful. Life expectancy was 20 1,000 years ago. You know, it was not in the interest of the human species to survive, for people to live much longer than that. Once you're 25, you've raised your kids, you're just using up the limited food and resources of the tribe, and life expectancy was under 25 1,000 years ago. It was 37 in 1800, it was 48 in 1900. This is in the developed world. The developing world was not that far behind, actually. It's now pushing 80, but that's all from the linear progression of health and medicine. I said to these 12-year-old kids, if it hadn't been for this progress we've made, you all would be senior citizens today. So it's been useful. But this is going to now go into high gear because health and medicine is now an information technology. First of all, we have the software of life, our genes. We have 23,000 genes. They are little software programs. They may not be written in C++. I think they're written in COBOL. Interesting that people have heard of COBOL here. Actually, they're written in three-dimensional protein interactions, which we can now model and simulate. The genome project itself was exponential. I predicted when it was announced in 1990 that it would take 15 years, and there were some renegade scientists who also said that. Mainstream scientists said, there's no way you're going to do this 15 years. We just had our best scientists and graduate students and most advanced equipment and around the world in 1989. We collected 1/10,000th of the genome. This is going to take centuries. Halfway through the project, 7 years into a 15-year project, only 1% of the genome had been collected. So the critics said, I told you this wasn't going to work. 7 years, 1%, it's going to take 700 years, like we said. My reaction was, no, it's almost done. We're right on schedule. Once you get to 1%, that's only 7 doublings from 100%. It had been doubling every year. There's many theoretical reasons why that will continue. And indeed, that's what happened. It continued to double every year. It was finished 7 years later, a year ahead of schedule. That's the sort of surprising power of exponential growth. And we have the means now of actually changing this outdated software. I mean, how long do you go without updating the software on your phone? This is probably updating itself now as I speak. But I am still walking around with outdated software that evolved tens of thousands of years ago, if not longer, in my body. For example, my fat insulin receptor gene says, hold on to every calorie because the next hunting season may not work out so well. And that was a great idea 1,000 years ago. You worked all day to get a few calories. There were no refrigerators, so you stored them in the fat cells of your body. We would not have survived otherwise. I would like to tell my fat insulin receptor gene, you don't need to do that anymore. I'm confident the next hunting season will be good. And that was tried in animal experiments, actually near where I work, the Jalzin Diabetes Center in Boston. And these animals ate ravenously and remained slim and got the health benefits of being slim. They didn't get diabetes, they didn't get heart disease, they lived 20% longer, they got the benefits of caloric restriction while doing the opposite. They figured that this is going to be a pretty successful human drug, and they're working with a pharmaceutical company to bring that to the human market. That's just one of the 23,000 genes we'd like to consider modifying. There are genes that have been identified that are needed to progress cancer or atherosclerosis, which causes heart attacks and strokes. Turning off those genes would stop or at least impede those disease processes. There are other genes we've identified that protect us from disease or from aging. We have means now of turning genes off and adding new genes. RNA interference, for example, can turn off genes. New forms of gene therapy can add genes. I'm involved with a project where we take lung cells out of the body, scrape them out of the throat, And then we add a new gene in vitro in a petri dish. This is better than the old techniques where we used to infect the body with a new gene, because viruses are basically genes wrapped in proteins. So we'd send a desired new gene as a virus, but that had unintended consequences that would trigger the immune system. The gene wouldn't end up in the right place. Here we can do it outside the body. It doesn't trigger the immune system. We can inspect that it got done correctly. Then we replicate the cell millions-fold. That's another new technology. Inject it back into the bloodstream. Goes through the bloodstream. The body recognizes them as lung cells, and they end up back in the lungs. Now you've added millions of cells with your DNA, but with a gene you didn't have before. Turns out in this case, it's a gene, the absence of which causes a fatal disease, pulmonary hypertension. And by adding back that gene, it cures that disease, and this is undergoing human trials. That's just one of the hundreds of drugs and processes in the development and testing pipeline that use this idea of reprogramming biology as a set of information processes. A whole exciting area is stem cells. You can take stem cells and turn them into a new liver, a new kidney, heart muscle cells to rejuvenate your heart. In fact, it used to be if you had a heart attack, you had a 1/3 chance of dying. That's still the case. You had a 1/3 chance of permanently damaging the heart, and a 1/3 chance that you got off easy with a warning. So half the survivors have a damaged heart, which can in fact leave them a heart cripple. Now you can actually get your heart rejuvenated with stem cell therapies. I know someone who was a real heart cripple, could hardly walk, and now is fully cured of that through this kind of stem cell therapy. We've worked around this embryonic stem cell ethical controversy by being able now to create the equivalent of embryonic stem cells without embryos, basically taking your skin cells, of which you have a lot, and they're easily accessible, adding 4 genes, and turning it into an equivalent of an embryonic stem cell. They're called IPCs, induced pluripotent cells. But there never was an embryo involved, and the ethicists who are opposed to embryonic stem cell research support this. In fact, they want to see this prevail, because then people will stop using embryonic stem cells because there's no destruction of an embryo. And anyway, as a patient, if you need a new kidney, you'd like it to have your DNA, not the DNA of some other embryo. So these are just a few examples. I mean, we could talk all afternoon. Of course, there are whole conferences on this topic of how we are basically reprogramming biology as if it were a set of software, which in fact is what it is. And a key point there is that now that it's subject to being an information technology, it is subject to the law of accelerating returns. It will now approximately double in power every year. That means these technologies and the things I've mentioned are in an early stage, but they'll be 1,000 times more capable and more powerful for the same cost in 10 years, 1,000,000 times more powerful in 20 years, and it will be a very different era. Let's talk about physical things. Suppose I want to send you a movie or a book or a music album. A few years ago, I would send you a package, which you would get in the mail or Federal Express. Today, I can send you an email attachment. I can email you a movie, a book, or a sound recording. And in fact, there are millions of these items that are free and open source. That, by the way, has not destroyed these industries. These industries, despite a lot of gnashing of teeth of new business models, are doing fine. They're bigger than they were before, because even though you can get millions of songs free, people still want to pay for songs from their favorite artist. You can see millions of movies for free, but people still pay to see Harry Potter or to buy Harry Potter or the latest bestseller and so on. That is actually the future of the economy. But I can also email you a violin, and I'll show you a picture of that in a moment, if you happen to have a 3-dimensional printer. And this is an emerging area of technology, and it's just a little bit before being completely economically viable. So it's kind of like search engines where people were experimenting with it, but it really wasn't viable yet. It's going to be viable very soon. These 3-dimensional printers used to cost tens of thousands of dollars each. Now they're thousands of dollars. They will soon be hundreds of dollars. The precision is now in microns. That's millions of a meter. That's not bad, but there's a lot of things you can't make. I can't really email you a blouse yet. But that's improving at a rate of 100 in 3D volume per decade. It's exponential improvement in the fineness of grain of the products you can create. It'll be down to nanotechnology by the 2020s, and I really can email you a blouse or even food or modules to build housing. That you can actually do today. This is a pin for Singularity University, which I co-founded, and it's in Silicon Valley, backed by Google and NASA. And it brings entrepreneurism to education, and the students do these sort of entrepreneurial projects, which they self-organize. One of the projects is to use three-dimensional printers to print out modules that you then snap together Lego style to create a very high quality but very low cost house. And the input materials to print out these things are very inexpensive. Today, with your three-dimensional printer, you can print out 70% of the parts you need to make another three-dimensional printer. That will be 100% within a decade. This is going to revolutionize manufacturing, and it will make the world of things an information technology as well. So it's not just these electronic gadgets for which this is true. And I will comment on the economic statistics, which is today, if you produce or consume $1 of computation or communication, it counts as $1 of economic activity, despite the fact that it's actually $1 million worth of computation or communication circa 1990 or $1 billion circa 1975. It still counts as $1, and this fantastic improvement in price performance is sort of factored out of the economic statistics. And you may say, okay, well, that's true of this weird world of electronic gadgets, but it's not true of housing and food and other types of things. My point is that everything ultimately will become information technology and be subject to this 50% deflation rate. So let me just show you how pervasive this is. And I'll have to go through this quickly, but I have a group of 10 people that gathers data in many different areas. This is what I wanted to cover. Are there any questions on any of this? I'll do it just a little slower. So I'm going to get, okay, here's one graph. Now, the graph on the right, you may not be able to read it, but it's a logarithmic graph. So as you go up the graph, we're multiplying by powers of 10. In fact, every level that's labeled there is 1,000 times greater than the level below it. And that's the 20th century on the x-axis. And so that represents trillions-fold increase in something over the last 100 years. In what? In this case, it's number of bits we send around the world wirelessly. So a century ago, that was Morse code over AM radio. Now it's 4G networks. So there's been a fantastic scale of progress, but look at how smooth a progression that is. You don't see, the headlines, this telecommunication company goes out of business, or multi-billion-dollar investment here, and so on. New breakthrough in 4G communication. It's remarkable how smooth the progression that is. So here's that graph I had of computation through 1980. I don't know how well you can read it, but this goes through 2009. So I had it up through 1980 and 1981. And was really amazed at how smooth the progression was. Again, every labeled level here is 100,000 times greater than the level below it, 5 decimal orders of magnitude. So again, that represents trillions-fold increase in price performance, a billion-fold just since I was a student. And again, you see it's gone through all these different paradigms. They finally couldn't shrink vacuum tubes anymore in the 1950s. It then jumped to transistors and so on. And the fifth paradigm, which is Moore's Law, people say, oh, this is Moore's Law. But no, Moore's Law is just one piece of this. And it also pertains to things other than computers. This will give way to the sixth paradigm of three-dimensional computing. Really, in a few years' time, already a portion of memory chips are three-dimensional. And you'll actually notice it's not a straight line. A straight line on a logarithmic scale is exponential growth. There's actually exponential growth in the rate of exponential growth. But I think the most amazing thing about this is look at how smooth a trajectory this is. Where's World War I or World War II or the Cold War or the Great Depression or anything, any of the examples of history in the 20th century? I could buy a transistor for $1 in 1968. You can get billions of them today. They're not only cheaper, but they're better because they're smaller, therefore they're faster. The cost of a transistor cycle has come down by half every year. That's a 50% deflation rate I was talking about. Now, economists actually worry about deflation, and they worry about this source of deflation because at least some economists are aware that more and more areas of the economy are becoming information technologies. And if they have a 50% deflation rate, meaning you can get the same amount of computation, communication, genetic sequencing, brain data, whatever it is you want that's information technology, a year later for half the price, you will buy more, but you're not going to double your consumption. So you'll buy more, but you won't quite make up for that doubling of price performance. So the economy, not as measured in bits and base pairs, but as measured in dollars, will shrink. And for a variety of actually good reasons, that would not be a good thing. That is, in fact, not what happens. We, in fact, more than double our consumption every year. There's been 18% growth in every area of information technology in constant currency, despite the fact you can get twice as much of it each year for the same price. And the reason for that is that as price performance reaches certain levels, whole new applications explode on the landscape. People didn't buy iPods for $15,000, which is what it would have cost 16 years ago. As price performance reaches certain levels, whole new ways of doing business become common. National Institutes of Health in the United States are collecting 1 million genomes to relate genetic states to disease states. They wouldn't do that if the genome still cost $1 billion each, which is what the first one cost. Now that it's becoming a few $1,000s, they can do that. So this is a profound revolution, the biotechnology revolution. There's many different aspects of it, all of which are scaling up exponentially, but we can now actually reprogram biology, and we can design purposeful interventions rather than just stumbling upon them accidentally. And every aspect of that is growing exponentially. Here's that graph on the left. I had just the first few points in the early 1980s of the predecessor to the internet. It was called the ARPANET. And it was connecting a few thousand scientists. And I did the math and said, this is going to be a World Wide Web connecting hundreds of millions of people to each other and to vast knowledge resources by the late 1990s. And people thought that was nuts when the entire American defense budget could tie together 2,000 scientists in a year. But that's the power of exponential growth, and that is what happened. The graph on the right is the same data, but seen on a linear scale rather than a logarithmic scale. And this is actually how we experience it. So it looked like, to the casual observer, the World Wide Web came out of nowhere in the mid-1990s, but you could see it coming. So here's that violin. This is not an artist's conception. This is an actual violin, and it plays very well. And the range of products that you can produce is getting wider and wider as the scale of precision gets finer and finer. This will be nanotechnology at the molecular level by the 2020s. We'll actually borrow some of the mechanisms from biology to do that. And all of this is scaling up exponentially, including in price performance as the cost comes down. And one of the applications will be to medicine. If I were to say you'll have millions of little nanobots, blood cell-sized devices that perform therapeutic functions in your bloodstream in about 20 years, you'd say that sounds pretty futuristic, but I'd point out there's already a few dozen experiments of doing that already in animal experiments. One scientist cured type 1 diabetes in rats with a blood cell-sized device that lets insulin out in a controlled fashion and blocks antibodies. The quintessential application of this technology will be a robotic white blood cell to augment your immune system. I used to call it the killer app, but that was not a great idea. But our immune system, these little white blood cells we have are intelligent creatures. They can detect an enemy, and I've actually watched mine in a microscope outside the body, but it detected a bacteria, and it cleverly blocked its escape path and ultimately destroyed it. It was very slow. It was boring to watch. And it's also not very complete. Now, we wouldn't last long without one. They're great, but there's many viruses they don't detect. They don't pick up on cancer. It thinks it's you. These can be programmed to be far more versatile and powerful. So this is a technology that's coming as well. Time magazine recently did a cover story on my idea. They wanted to print that graph, which you see on computers, and they said, but we want you to include this computer we actually covered in the magazine a few weeks ago. And I know that any computer that's proposed will not be above the curve. Sometimes they're below the curve just because you may be paying extra money for some feature, like a wood cabinet or something. And so sometimes computers are below the price-performance curve of the industry. But it was actually right on the curve. And this is a curve I put together in 1981. It's remarkable how predictive it has been. And similar curves in other areas of information technology have a similar track record. So the most important frontier is understanding the brain. That is progressing exponentially. We can actually see now with enough precision to see individual interneuronal connections in a living brain and see them firing in real time. We can see our brain create our thoughts. We can see our thoughts create our brain, because that is part of the paradigm of human intelligence. As we think of something, we actually create new connections that reflect that knowledge. And this is scaling up exponentially. This spatial resolution of non-invasive brain scanning is doubling every year. The amount of data we're gathering is doubling every year. And we're showing that we can understand this data sufficiently to model and simulate it. This is a simulation, a picture of a simulation of the cerebral cortex where we do our hierarchical symbolic thinking. And there have been models and simulations and tests of those simulations of many different regions: the auditory cortex, the visual cortex, where we process visual information, the cerebellum, where we do our skill formation, like catching a fly ball is largely done by the cerebellum. We always wondered, how does a 10-year-old kid do that? She needs to solve a dozen simultaneous differential equations in 2 seconds in order to catch the ball. And most 10-year-olds haven't taken calculus. So how does that work? Well, the cerebellum actually does solve those equations. That's basically what it does. And we have reverse engineered that and created models and simulations and then tested them with human skill formation tasks, and they work quite well. So this is in an early stage still, but we're gaining real insights. We're maybe at that point in this project where we were in the genome project, when we were halfway through the project, but it actually finished 1% of the project, and critics were saying, oh, there's so much about the genome that we haven't sequenced compared to what we have, and we're barely begun, yet we're halfway through the project. It's a similar phenomena here, because this is all scaling up exponentially. And perhaps we're even further along than that, because we have some actually good models of how the cerebral cortex works. I'm writing a book on that now called How the Mind Works and How to Build One. And I will actually present a thesis for how our thinking works, which is done in the cerebral cortex. And maybe we'll get to that in the Q&A portion. So let me deal with one more implication before we have time for some dialogue, which is, okay, we're making this exponential progress in certain things measured a certain way. Is that good or bad? Is that helping or hurting human civilization? Quite aside from the role of technology, are things getting better or worse? There's a very strong perception that things are getting worse historically, that things are better in the old days, particularly before technology kind of corrupted our ability to appreciate the natural world. And I think we lose perspective, so I've put together some graphs. I'll show you just a couple of them that give you a sense of the progress we've made over the last 100 or 200 years. I will say that one of the reasons that people think things are getting worse is we do a much better job today and have much more powerful tools at seeing the problems. So when there's a battle in Fallujah, it's not just that we hear about it. We are there. We're in the middle of the battle. That was not true some decades ago. If 30,000 people died in a battle in World War II, if you saw it at all, it was in a grainy newsreel in the movie theaters 3 weeks later. There wasn't the immediacy of information. It's not like problems didn't exist in the world before. If you happen to read literature, you might actually hear about them. If you read Thomas Hobbes today or Charles Dickens, you can see how incredibly desperate and disaster-prone human life was 200 years ago. Thomas Hobbes described it as short, brutish, disaster-prone, disease-filled, and poverty-filled. Life was extremely difficult. But let's see this illustrated. Those little circles are countries. You can probably make out China there. In fact, keep an eye on China, because it does some interesting things. The x-axis is the wealth of nations. It's basically income per person, GDP per capita in today's dollars. So even though this is 1,800, those are 2009 dollars. And it's basically hundreds of dollars. Now there's a have-not divide. Some nations are wealthier than others, but they're all basically in hundreds of dollars of today's dollars in per capita income. On the y-axis, it's health is measured by life expectancy. Now I have graphs that are similar to this with other measures of health and wealth, but this one is good as an example. So human life expectancy was in the 20s and 30s. Worldwide average was 37 in 1800. So let's see if things got better or worse over the last 200 years. This is now the early industrial revolution. A few countries are making a little bit of progress, but it's not affecting much of the world. China does some strange things. As we get to the 20th century, you will see a wind move all these countries up towards the upper right-hand corner of the graph. There still will be, and is today, a have-not divide. But at the end of this process, the countries that are worst off are far better off than the countries that were best off at the beginning of the process. And this is not slowing down. In fact, it's picking up speed. Clearly, the have-not divide is still something we need to address because, in fact, our expectations change. We expect better things for the human population. But if you talk about the impact of technology and the general trend, it's very much in the right direction. That's not a call to be complacent about the problems that still exist. What's driving this is human productivity in constant dollars has gone from $30 to $130 in today's dollars over the last half century. And again, the value of a dollar as it comes to information technology over the last 30 years is millions of times greater, but it doesn't count for millions of times more because we completely factor that out of the economic statistics. So I'll finally just leave you with this one last graph, which I've already alluded to. This is what we've done with the linear progression of health and medicine before it was an information technology. And this is going to go into high gear soon. We're still in an early stage, but when that exponential gets to a real point of inflection in about 15 years, we will be adding more than a year every year to your remaining life expectancy in about 15 years. So if you can hang in there, we may get to see the remarkable century ahead. Thank you very much.